Hey Sabi says, quick question. Marxists tend to have this idea of historical progression or stages. How would you go about dissecting this thinking? I mean, there's a lot of ways it is problematic. One is that things didn't really progress in this sort of like mechanical stagist conception. I think they were only able to think that when it was originally conceived because they didn't have very much anthropology and they didn't really know the specific conditions of the historical progress of a variety of different kinds of projects, societies, cultural histories. And what they did have was a really good and sophisticated knowledge of how capitalism developed. So what they saw was capitalism developed through these very clear class structures. And here we really see how class divisions were driving this project of development of capitalism. And, you know, in their mind, I think this gave them the idea that this was going to be, universally true as the central driving factor for all stages of history. And then what they tried to do is project back with their faulty anthropological and historical data that, you know, there was just like, there's primitive communism in the state of nature. Then you've got the development into feudalism, and then feudalism inherently develops into capitalism, and then capitalism will inherently develop into communism. I think what they fail to understand is that these were not inevitable processes of development. Some places did this in fits and starts. Some places didn't really do it at all. Many places were forced into it through explicit violence and colonization. So like you have a bunch of places where, you know, they had a quote unquote primitive communism, as the Marxists sometimes call it, and they didn't try to move into feudalism. They just stuck with it. It wasn't until some feudal lord or another came, bumbling by trying to dominate them that they ever moved into anything looking like feudalism. Or sometimes, as we see in many of these examples of colonialism, straight from quote unquote primitive communism into being subsumed straight into capitalism, right? So like, it's first of all factually incorrect. Factually, it's just not correct insofar as we can look back at history. Furthermore, I think that one of the problems is that once you think that history acts and that there are inevitable stages, then you conceive that everything is just going to take place organically and it's going to work itself out and move in the forward direction. It's a sort of what I would call a progressivist teleology. It has the conception that there's always this movement towards greater and greater freedom, which probably comes from them having read too much Hegel, because that's what he thinks. Then what you've got is essentially people who take for granted everything is going to kind of move forward and evolve, that capitalism is going to become so capitalist that it just turns socialist, that like that's going to be an organic process that just absolutely inevitably happens. However, once again, that just does not appear to be true. The development of capitalism only appears to be holding capitalism more and more rigidly in stasis, wherein it denies the ability of all other replacement projects to take place. So there's no reason to believe that capitalism is just going to, all at once, now, it's socialism. We're going to capitalism so hard, we socialism. That, I think, is fully nonsensical, especially when we actually look at the transitions that took place that made us move from one of these to another. And what we see is that they only took place through the conscious action of human beings to change conditions and engage in new ways of living. Let's take the capitalists, for example. The capitalists arose in the Italian and Spanish low-lying borgs or burgs. This is where the word burg comes from, on the end of words. It means cities, and it's also where the word bourgeois comes from, which means city dweller. And this is because the bourgeois developed in these little Italian city-states. And they developed from a merchant class that had a heavy overlap with the lords. And they began to gain power by prefiguring capitalism, essentially. They began building businesses and hiring workers and acquiring control of the means of production and replacing the workshop system with the factory system and so on. This is the process that took place. The capitalists gained power by building power. They built the new in the shell of the old. And this was done through conscious action to expand the power of this alternative way of doing things. So when people say, that capitalism is just going to develop so much all once we do a communism, this is patently absurd. Because the only way that feudalism transitioned into capitalism was by the active creation of the new system within the belly of the old system. It did not come about by feudalisming really hard, right? Feudalism did not just like do more feudalism and expand feudalism, and then all at once, magically, it turned into capitalism. No. Contradictory elements of capitalism that were prepared and capable of developing into the feudal system arose within the feudal system. So similarly, if we want to see a development into a new stage of society, which might replace capitalism with something that we might call socialism, then we have to begin building this new structure. We have to actually create the alternative structure to the structure that currently exists. If indeed there is any organic process that drives us toward the development of the next stage of society, it is only through this development of a radical, militant class consciousness, wherein we begin building the structures that are necessary to empower us and not the previous society.